Hi, I'm Nick Cipollina. In today's video, we're going to cover CI/CD with Azure DevOps and container images. In my last video, we covered container images in C#. And in this video, what I'd like to do is walk through setting up a CI/CD pipeline with Azure DevOps using those container images. We'll store our source code in GitHub, and we'll be deploying our container to AWS. So we're going to start off with a basic container Lambda function, which this should look very similar because this is just the default template that you get out of the box with the AWS Lambda tools. We have our Docker file, our function, the README, the project, all the other stuff, and this project already has our serverless YAML file because we've already defined that, and this project is otherwise ready to go. But what we need to do first is we need to set up a build pipeline in Azure DevOps. Now, when Azure DevOps first introduced the concept of build pipelines, the entire process was done through a visual editor in the website where you would actually go in and you'd set up your build pipeline by dragging tasks and setting the configuration values, etc., for each of those tasks. But now it's a YAML-based configuration that you can actually add to your source code, which is actually pretty cool. So instead of having to take and go into Azure DevOps to completely configure this from the ground up, you can just add your YAML file to your project and set up all of that configuration within that YAML file. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a new file, and we're going to call that Azure pipelines.yaml. And we're going to go ahead and start defining that. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to want to add our trigger, because this is essentially what is going to tell the pipeline to start building. And we will include our, let's see here, our main branch, because that's the branch that we want to build. Now, you're saying we're building a CI/CD pipeline, so why would we only want to include the main branch? Well, because the main branch is the branch that we want to build for, in this case, for our releases. And you may actually want to do something where, say you're using the GitFlow methodology and you wanted to build releases, you wanted to build develop, you wanted to build your main, and you can specify all that in the YAML file. And this is just an array of branches, but for purposes of our demo, we're just going to go ahead and set it up for main. Now, the other thing that we're going to want to do, though, is we are going to want to trigger this build anytime that we have a pull request, so that if there's a pull request out there, we can actually make sure that the source code builds before we would do anything with it. So we can do that by simply adding the PR section and specifying which branch that we want to do the pull request into in order to trigger the build. And so that's what this part does. And then the next section is where we're going to define the pool that we want to use. So since this is a .NET Core, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use Ubuntu's latest. And basically what this says is for the virtual machine image, go ahead and get an Ubuntu and get the latest version of that. All right, so then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up some variables, because that's another really cool thing that you can do with Azure DevOps build pipelines is you can specify variables. So we're going to set up a variable by simply defining a variable section, and then each variable is just a sub element under variables. So we're going to create one that's called repository name, and we're going to set that to be serverless container, if I could spell, CI/CD. And what that is essentially going to be is that's going to be the name of our Docker repository, so that whenever we build our container, that's the repository that we're going to pull it to. Then the next variable that we're going to define is called isPullRequest. And what we are doing here is we need a variable for when after we've built the project and we've built our container, the isPullRequest is going to determine whether or not we push it to our ECR repository. Because if this is a pull request build, we're not going to want to push that container image to ECR because then we'll end up with a lot of extra images that we don't actually need. The only images that we care about are the ones that are going to be built off of main, which is our production ready code. So we're going to set a variable so that we know whether or not it's a pull request, so that we can determine whether we're going to do that task or not. And we're going to use their interpolation syntax to determine this. So we specify starts with, and there are some built-in variables that you get with your pipeline out of the box, and we're going to use one of those, and it's called build source branch. And what we're going to do, oops, let me get my syntax right here. What we're going to do is we're going to look to see if the source branch starts with refs pull, and if it does, then that means that our build is a pull request build. Let's see here. I think that's right. Yeah, I got my syntax right. All right, so then now those are the two variables that we're going to need for this particular pipeline. So now we're going to actually set up our steps, and this is kind of the meat of the build pipeline. This is where we're going to define all of the individual tasks that we're going to perform on this build in order to actually build this container image and deploy it to AWS. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a task called Docker sign 2. And the syntax for these tasks is you have the task name and then your @ and then the version number. So this is actually version 2. We're going to give it a display name of build image, and this is what will actually show up in our Azure DevOps pipeline. Whenever it builds, it'll display build image. So when it runs that particular task in this step, then we'll actually see the term build image, and so we'll know that that's what we're actually doing with this. And then each task has a set of inputs, and so we're going to go ahead and specify our inputs. For the Docker task, we need to specify a command. Because, what is it that we're doing? In this case, we're building. And we also need to specify the repository. And in this case, we've already got a variable defined for our repository, so we're just going to go ahead and reference that. And so this is the format that you'd use to reference a variable. So we're just going to say that we're going to use our repository name for the repository. All right, so that's it for the Docker task. Next, we're going to set up our ECR push image task. And so I'm just going to go ahead and copy this just to make sure I don't make a typo, because this one is kind of long, and paste it in over here. But this one is called Amazon Web Services.aws-vsts-tools.ecr push image.ecr push image @1. And so that's saying it's the first version of that particular task. We're going to give it a display name of push image to ECR, and we're going to specify a condition on this task, because if you'll recall, when we created our isPullRequest variable, we said we were going to use that so that we didn't automatically just push this to the ECR registry every time we do a build, especially if it's a pull request. So we're going to set a condition, and that condition is and succeeded not equal, and this is where we're going to say not equal variables dot is pull request true. So what we're saying here is, all right, if the previous task succeeded and our is pull request variable is not equal to true, then we will run this task. So for a scenario where the branch is main and it's not a pull request into main, we will do the ECR push image. If it is a pull request, we'll skip this task. So we're going to go ahead and set up our inputs. And for this one, we need to specify our AWS credentials. And I will get to this a little bit later in the video as far as what these are. But the important thing to note is that the AWS credentials is actually the name of the AWS credentials that you set up in your Azure DevOps repository. So I'll cover that a little bit later in the video, but we're going to call that AWS account. So just kind of file that away for later. Then we're going to specify our region name, and we're going to use US East 1. We will go ahead and specify our source image name. And the source image name is going to be the same as our repository. So that's why we have our variable set up. It's going to be repository name. And next we will specify our source image tag. And this again is where we're going to take advantage of some of the Azure DevOps built-in build variables. So this is going to be our build ID. And the reason that we're using the build ID is this is going to give us a unique tag every time we run this build, but then we'll also have access to this build ID in our release pipeline, so that whenever we go to deploy this to our serverless function, we'll be able to reference the tag from this. We're going to specify our repository name, which should be no surprise. This will be referring to the repository name variable again. And next we will specify our push tag, which is going to be the same as our source image tag. So we use the build ID variable again. And the last thing we're going to specify is auto create repository. And we're going to set this to true. So this means that if the repository doesn't exist already, we'll go ahead and create it. So the important thing to note is that means that whatever AWS account you use for your pipeline will have to have the ability to create new ECR repositories within your AWS account. And so that's it for our push image tag. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a copy files task. And the reason for that is we need to take and copy our serverless YAML file to our staging directory so that when the release runs, it'll have that serverless file to actually deploy the code to AWS. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this task in and paste it just to make sure I don't make any mistakes. And so we'll set our display name to be copy serverless YAML file to our artifact staging directory. We're going to specify our inputs. The source folder is going to be source/serverless CI/CD, which that's the path to our project. We're going to look for the serverless.yaml file, and we are going to target the artifact staging directory /drop folder. And so what that's going to do is that's going to copy our serverless YAML file to that drop folder. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to specify a task to the publish pipeline artifact, and we'll go ahead and specify our inputs for this one. And I'm not giving this a display name because in this one, this is fairly self-explanatory. We're just publishing those artifacts, and we're going to specify our target path of let's see here, it's going to be staging directory /drop. And again, we're using those built-in variables that Azure DevOps provides out of the box. And we are going to be copying the artifact called drop, which is our folder. All right, so we now have our Azure Pipelines YAML file. And to go ahead and set this up, this is going to be as simple as committing this to our project. So we're going to go ahead and say added pipeline YAML file, and we'll do a commit and push. And so, yep, here's our window, and we'll go ahead and push that. And so now if we come over to GitHub, we can look in our source serverless CI/CD folder. And let's see here, if we refresh this, we see that we now have an Azure Pipelines YAML file. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to come over to Azure DevOps and we're going to set up our pipeline. And so the first thing you'll notice, I've got a brand new Azure DevOps repo that I set up called demo. doesn't have anything in it yet. We're going to go ahead and go to pipelines. And as you can see, we don't have any pipelines. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create our first pipeline. So we'll click the Create Pipeline button. And once this loads, you can see that the first thing that it's doing is it's looking to see where your code is. And so you can actually use Azure Git repos, Bitbucket Cloud, GitHub, GitHub Enterprise Server, or some other Git repository that you might have, or you can even use something like Subversion. And then you'll notice that down here we have a link that's called Use This Classic Editor, which, as you recall, I mentioned earlier in the video that you could previously create your pipeline without YAML and actually do it through the Classic Editor. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do it through YAML. So we will click the GitHub button here to configure our GitHub repository. And it should be loading our repositories. Yep, it did. So I'm going to click on our container CI/CD one, and you'll notice that it found our pipeline YAML file, which is good. One thing to note off camera, I did have to move this. I didn't realize it, but it had created it in the wrong folder. And in order for Azure DevOps to find it most efficiently, it works best if it's in your root folder for your source control. So I went ahead and moved it to the root folder. But as you can see, this is our pipeline file. So we're just I'm not gonna run it just yet. I'm gonna go ahead and save it. And it's giving me a commit message because it actually wants to commit it to the main branch directly. Must have a few minor changes, so we'll go ahead and do that. And it's gonna go ahead and create the pipeline for us. And all right, so if we come back, you can see we've got our pipelines. One thing that I will point out is that it named it based off of the GitHub organization and the repository name. So I'm going to go ahead and change the name of that to be something more friendly. So we'll go ahead and call this our serverless container CI/CD, so that we know that it's our serverless container CI/CD pipeline, and we'll save that. And it's now ready. So if we didn't make any mistakes in our serverless YAML file, or our Azure Pipelines YAML file, we should be able to run this pipeline. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to click Run. It did. It found an issue with that. So, I've noticed this before, and I think it has to do with the fact that it wanted to save that whenever we created the pipeline. So I'm going to go back to my project here, and I'm going to open that pipelines file back up, and I'm going to just go ahead and copy this and make sure. It could have just been that I had some indentation issues or something as well. So we'll go ahead and save that, and updated. And the other nice thing about this is this should actually, I should select the files I'm committing. This should actually trigger the build if everything was set up correctly. So let's go ahead and see if that happened, and we'll push it and see what happens. All right, so it updated that. So let's go ahead and merge that. And let's go see, that should have triggered a build. Let's refresh this screen. If not, we'll run it for the first time. Nope, we're still getting an error. So let me see. Do this update one more time. Oh, there, it just finished pushing. So, maybe it still hadn't pushed yet. So, look, and now it's actually running, which that's good. So, we have an error in our run though. Step ECR. Oh, that's right, because we forgot to set up our AWS credentials, which is good. So I'm glad that we actually got that, because this is a good view into this, and you can actually see the error message and why the particular build failed. So to set up our AWS credentials, we have to tie this thing together with our AWS account. So we're going to come into project settings, and we're going to come over here to service connections, which the AWS connection is a service connection. And we're going to click, and you'll notice that we've got our GitHub connection here already defined. We're going to come up here and we're going to click New Service Connection, and we're going to click AWS, and we're going to specify Next. So we have to specify our access key ID, which is here. And then we need our secret key, which I'll go ahead and paste that in. If you're using session tokens, you can specify those. If you have roles you want to assume, role session names, etc., you can specify all those things. And then the other thing that we need to specify is our AWS account. And if you'll recall from our pipeline file, it was expecting credentials called AWS account. And so that's what we're setting up here. So we're calling it AWS account. And then we're going to grant access to permission to all pipelines because we might want to use our AWS credentials in other pipelines as well. And we'll go ahead and hit save. And so now we've got that connection set up. So if we come back to our pipelines, no, I don't want to save that last pass. We come back to our pipelines. Our serverless container CI/CD pipeline, we should be able to run that again. So we're going to use the main branch, no commits, and we're just going to let the default options, and we're going to run it. And it should start the run. And so you can see it's queued up. So I'm going to come in here and click on this and wait for this job to start running. So, oh, it actually started. I was going to say sometimes it can take a little while, but it actually started. As it's going through and building this repository, I just wanted to point out a couple things. So the checkout task wasn't something that we defined, and that's just something that happens automatically with a build pipeline since we're triggering it from source code. But you can notice the task names match up with the display names that we specified in our Azure YAML file. So here we've got our build image and push the image to ECR. We're going to copy our serverless YAML file, and then we'll publish the pipeline artifact, which we didn't actually name this particular task, if you'll recall. So that's what it does. Azure DevOps does out of the box, is it just uses the task name to name it. But the cool thing about this, though, is that you can see as it's going through and it's building our container image, you can see the output of that. And while that's happening, I wanted to go over and show you, although I may be too late, but we don't have any ECR container registries right now. And once this particular push task completes, we should have one. In fact, it may have already created it because it's in the process of preparing it. So let's just refresh the screen to see. And once it finishes, yep, you can see we now have our repository. See if and the image is actually there. And so the one thing I wanted to call out, remember we used our build ID to tag the particular image. Well, you can see that the image was tagged as 257. And if we come back here, and I think if it's in the initialized job, I'm trying to see. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not there. But if we look at the push image to ECR, we don't see that output there either. I'm trying to remember where you can get the build ID, but that's not important. For right now, though, so now we've got our build pipeline set up, and we're all ready to go. Except that only covers the build portion of it. What if we want to do release? So we're going to go back to Azure DevOps, and under pipelines, you can see there's a tab called releases. So we're going to click on this releases tab so that we can configure a new release. And of course, you can see there's no release pipeline here. So we're going to click new pipeline to create a new one. And then once that loads, we are going to select our template. Now they give you a lot of common templates out of the box that you could use and then just configure things like Azure App Service deployments, or deploying a Node.js app to Azure App Service, or say you were building a classic ASP.NET website that utilized SQL Server database, or even ASP.NET Core. You could use this template, but for us, we're building one that's fairly custom and it's not a super common scenario. So we're just going to start with an empty job to make things simpler. And so first thing that we're going to do is we're going to come up here and give this a name, and we're going to call it, if we click the edit button, we are going to call this our CI/CD container release, so that we know that's our container release. And then we're going to name our stage. I like to name my stages after the branch, so we're going to name this our main stage. And then the first thing we're going to do after that is we're going to come over here, we're going to add an artifact, because this is essentially what it is that we're releasing. So we're going to click to add an artifact, and our source type is going to be build because we want to use our build pipeline. And we're going to select our serverless container CI/CD build pipeline. We're going to leave the default version as latest, but you have a couple options here. You can specify at the time of release creation. So if you weren't going to have your releases created automatically, you would select this option so that you could actually specify which version you wanted to use. You can specify the latest from the build pipeline default branch with tags. So say you wanted to use specific tags to trigger your releases, or you can do latest from a specific branch with tags, and not necessarily the pipeline default, but a specific branch, or you can do a specific version, or as we're going to do latest, because for purposes of this, that's what we need to use. Then we'll go ahead and click add. And so then after that, we are going to, let's see here. We are going to go ahead and we're going to click the deployment trigger button, because we want to set up our deployment trigger. And we are going to change this from disabled to enabled. And we are going to go ahead and add a branch filter, because we don't want to trigger this every single branch. So say at some point in the future, we add other branches that could trigger this build, but we don't necessarily want to do a deployment from those branches. We're going to go ahead and specify which branches to use. And in this case, we'll specify main. And then after that, we're going to set up our trigger on our main stage. So we'll come over here and click the triggers button. And we are going to select the after release. We've got the option of doing manual only or after release, but for us, we're going to do after release. And then we are going to specify an artifact filter. So we'll go ahead and enable this. And we're going to specify an artifact filter on serverless container, CI/CD, and we only want to do our build branch. And so for this scenario, we only have one release stage and we only have one branch that we're working with. But in a common CI/CD scenario, you're probably going to have, say, a development branch, and you might have a release that's configured to deploy to your user acceptance testing environment, and you may have a release that's triggered to deploy to your production environment. So you're going to have different stages, and you may be controlling those with different branches. So the artifact filter will ensure that it's only deploying from the branch that you care about to the particular stage that you're working with. And so, like I said, we're going to leave the after release trigger selected, and we're going to go ahead, and that is our pre-deployment conditions for our trigger. So next we're going to go to our task, and we're going to set up to our stages, and we're going to set up our task for our main stage. And so you'll notice that right now we've got our agent job, and there are no tasks defined. So in order to add our tasks, we're simply going to click the plus sign beside our task, and we're going to go ahead and find our task that we want to add to our release pipeline. And you'll notice that we've got a lot of pretty useful looking tasks that are in here. These are very similar to the tasks that are available in the build pipelines. In fact, some of them are the same tasks and some of them are not. They don't have the exact same tasks that are available in both pipelines, but pretty good feature parity between the two of them. But in this case, we're not using YAML files. We're using the classic interface that you would have had with your build pipelines because they don't yet support YAML files for releases. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come up here and we're going to do search, and we're going to search for Node because the first thing we need to do is install the Node.js tool installer. So I'm going to click on that and click Add. We'll come over here and configure this. And for us, we want to go ahead and we're going to use version 12.x, so we'll update the version spec to be 12.x because what this is going to do is this is going to install the Node.js tool so that we can actually use Node.js to install the serverless framework, because out of the box, your Azure DevOps release agents aren't going to have serverless framework installed on them. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come back here and we're going to click and add a new task, and we are going to search for npm because we need to run an npm command to install the serverless framework. So first thing we're going to do is the command we're going to run is install, but we're actually going to change this to custom because we want to do a global install, which you don't get with the basic install command. So we're going to specify install-g serverless. So what this is going to do is it's going to install the serverless framework, and it's going to ensure that the serverless commands are available to us in our pipeline. And then the last thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to add a task to actually run the serverless command to deploy our image to AWS. So we'll come over here and we will add a new task, and we are going to look for AWS tools because we want the AWS tools for Windows PowerShell script. And the reason for this is we have a couple things that we need to get. So what's nice about the AWS tools for Windows PowerShell is that they will actually leverage the AWS credentials that we configured for our build pipeline. So they will be available whenever you run your scripts for connecting to your AWS instance to perform whatever commands you need. So we'll go ahead and come in here and select our account. And then we are going to use US East 1 because that's the region that our ECR repository is in, as well as where we're going to deploy our Lambda function. And we're going to do an inline script. And note, we could have added this PowerShell script to our repository, and we could have referenced that from the script file, but I'm just going to go ahead and do this inline for now. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and paste my script in here, and then we'll talk through what this script is actually doing. So, all right, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually get the digest from our our container image from ECR. And so we're using the get ECR image command, specifying our region, our repository name, and then it's searching where the image tag matches our build ID. So as you can see, we still have access to our build ID variable within our release pipeline. And then we're going to select the property called image digest. And so we're going to set that to an environment variable called digest, because if you'll recall in our serverless YAML file, it's expecting the digest value in the URI to that image. Then the other piece of information that we're going to need is our AWS account. And so the next command, we're using the get STS caller identity and getting the account property off of that and setting it to our environment variable called AWS account. And so that'll make both of those variables available to our serverless YAML file, so that whenever we issue our serverless deploy, it will actually go ahead and read those environment variables and deploy it. And in this case, we're also specifying our stage as being main. All right, so, and then the last thing that we need to do with this particular task is we need to specify the working directory, because the serverless command actually has to run inside of or has to run where the serverless YAML file is. And if you recall, we put that into our drop folder, and then that is part of the artifact that comes from our build file. And so those carry over to your release pipelines, and so it will run inside of this drop folder where our serverless YAML file is. So we'll go ahead and hit OK. And now our pipeline is done. So we can go ahead and save this. And we'll go ahead and hit OK to save it. And we are now ready to run this. So what we can do is come back to the pipeline, and everything's all configured. So we're going to go ahead and create a release. And we are going to, actually we don't have to do anything. It's already pointing at our artifact, and it's using our latest build. So we'll go ahead and hit create. And so what this is going to do is it's going to go ahead and create our release, and it should go ahead and queue it. Yeah, so we can come in here and we can watch the logs. So very similar to what we had with our build pipeline, these logs are captured and output to the screen, and you can follow along as it goes through the entire build process. So this release pipeline actually takes a little while, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, because once it gets to the point where it installs the serverless framework, that takes a little while. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video now, and we'll pick back up once that's done. Okay, now that's completed. As you can see, this took a little over 5 minutes, which isn't too terribly long. But again, we've got our log file available here, so you can see that we had our use node command, which just said to install the node tools version 12.x. Our custom command, which we installed our serverless framework globally, and you can see that it went through and did that. And then it ran our AWS tools for Windows PowerShell script, which basically just captured those couple variables in environment variable and did the serverless deployment commands. And you can see we've got our endpoint here, and all the stuff that it usually creates. So let's go ahead and hop over to the AWS console. And of course, this hasn't been refreshed since the deployment. You can see we had no functions. If I refresh this, though, you can see that we now have our function. It's our serverless CI/CD main C# skill. And it should be, once this finishes loading here, we should see that it's pointing to our container image. Which if we go back over here, the digest is F952, and it looks like F952. It's the same digest, so that's the same container we've deployed. And come over here to API Gateway, and if we refresh, we should see an API Gateway as well that got created. Yep, our main serverless CI/CD. If we click on that, we can come in here and we can view our endpoint. Go to Stages and Hello. Get, and we should have our URL, so open that in a new tab, and it should invoke our function and just say hello AWS serverless. Great. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to show you is how the pull requests work and triggering those builds. So let's come in here and let's create a new branch. So come in here and say new branch, and let's just say feature demo changes. Create this new branch, and we're just going to come in here and make a change to our function, which if you've been watching my other videos, you've seen this before. It should be a very familiar contrived change. So we're going to say var name equals request dot string parameters. Make sure that's not null, and we'll look for one called name. And if that's null, we'll go ahead and say AWS serverless. So we're just adding a query string parameter for the name, and we'll come down here and go ahead and update that to be string interpolation. We'll save this, and we'll come over here and commit this change. We'll add that parameter, and we're going to push this out to GitHub so that some other member of our team can review our code and make sure that we are not going to break our production environment. So that's going to go ahead and commit that and push it. And we'll go back to GitHub and see if that's there. Yep. All right. So we've got this feature, and GitHub says, do you want to create a pull request? And we're going to go ahead and do that. So we'll click compare and pull request. We're adding a parameter, and of course we can put whatever we want. And here, we're just going to go ahead and put whatever we want, and we're going to create the pull request. And so what that should do is that should go ahead and trigger our build in Azure DevOps. So if we come back to Azure DevOps and look at the pipelines, we should see, it looks like there is a build that's been queued. And it's a PR automated queue, which is what we wanted. So if we go in here, yep, that's queued. So we go back to GitHub, we should see, yep, there is a build that is waiting to run. We click on the details, we can see that information and see that, yep, there's a pipeline in Azure DevOps that's going to run, that's going to go ahead and build this, which that's pretty cool. So as you can see, this is very powerful and useful way to, to trigger these builds and to set up those CI/CD pipelines. So thank you so much for joining me today for my video. I've included links to the source code for this, as well as links to the Azure DevOps task definitions, and also links to my previous videos. Thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you learned something.